When you're on the path of self-awareness, there are certain things that stick out for each person. And I'm not sure that it's the same for everybody, but for me, there were certain things that grasped me more than other things, and certain things which have been extremely difficult to let go of. And this one thing in particular that I want to discuss is this notion of learning. And I think it's interesting to think about this first in the societal context, how important it is in our society that we learn. I mean, one of the first things that you hear when you're a child is to learn from your mistakes. Things like curiosity are seen as valuable and important. And so I think a lot of the reason why we hang on to learning, and learning has become such a big part of our life, is because of the fact that we were taught that from a young age. And these days, learning is so easy to do, especially with the internet and now AI, that I think that learning is becoming ubiquitous as part of our lives. So how can learning be a hindrance to our spiritual development? And I can tell you that it certainly has been a hindrance to mine. And so let's get into that. So I think there are different kinds of learning. Krishnamurti once said, "What is there to learn about sorrow?" And so I want to kind of start from that and move forward, because the way that we use our minds in addressing all of the difficulties we have in our lives, all of the activities of the self, is important to understand. And for me, and probably for many other people that are on a spiritual path like this, of self-awareness and understanding and thinking very deeply about life and spirituality, learning probably plays a central role. But the question is that a help or a hindrance? So I think what Krishnamurti meant by what is there to learn about sorrow is it questions the role of learning in when you're sad. And I think there is in us this inherent attempt to try to understand when we have a problem. And I think that really is the seed there. You're upset about something and you want to understand it. You want to understand why. It could be this desire to analyze, or any sort of attempt to learn from that. And learning from that could be how to use that sadness to understand something about life, about spiritual truth. And so, the thought process and the ego and the self, all of those activities, to me, is like a chain reaction. You have something occur in your life that's made you very, very angry. And then the response to that is, I shouldn't get angry about this. So you've got one thought process, one activity of the self, which is the anger in response to a circumstance. And then there is the way we address that anger, or the response to that anger, with a new thought process, also activity of the self, to try to control it, or to try to say that you should be a different way. Now, on top of all of that, what I've noticed is that there is the desire to learn from that entire thing that just took place. And so I found that in myself. I found that in myself relentlessly. I think it is, for me, was one of the most tenacious things that inner self hung on to and pursued and created great efforts within me. And so as other aspects of those activities were understood through passive awareness, there was still this desire to learn. It can be a desire also to explain what happened. The explanation of what just occurred can be part of it. And the explanation in terms of what you think spiritually, tying into your beliefs. Very difficult. For me, that was the hardest thing to ease up on. Anytime I had any kind of problems, ultimately I wanted to understand it. I wanted to put it in the context of what I already knew. What I already knew about myself, what I already knew about spirituality. So that's the question. So is that helpful? That's the real question. And I don't think it is. Spirituality is about coming to a place of peace, coming to a place of quiet, not a forced quiet, but just a quiet place where I can sort of become more aware of something more essential about myself. And so thought processes get in the way. So getting back to what Krishnamurti said about what is there to understand or learn about sorrow? I mean, that's an interesting question to me. If we want to look at our sorrow, if we want to understand our sorrow, how it comes to being, if we want to see if being passively aware of that sorrow can lead to an ending of sorrow, what good is the attached thought processes of making humongous efforts intellectually to understand that sorrow? What good is that? And I think what I have found is, as I've been able to put aside that effort to understand, that effort to learn, that effort to explain, it is withered and rarely occurs to me these days. So I think that is a humongous part of the activity of our minds, this quest for learning, for understanding. And I think it's not the easiest thing to put aside. I think that we really have to start to question the value of thinking. Thinking is valued highly in our society and seems extremely important, like you can't live without it. But it seems to me that there is so much thinking going on in our minds that is completely unnecessary. Probably 90% of it. And part of what makes me feel that that's the case is that when you get on this hamster wheel of thinking, it seems endless. You know, it seems like you never really finished. There isn't a sense of completion, and there really isn't anything very satisfying about it. And so I think it took me some convincing of myself to say, hey, maybe this is not worth anything. You know, people talk about faith. Faith in God, faith in Jesus, learning to believe in things that we don't necessarily, that we can't really see for ourselves. And, obviously, I have questions about whether belief is valuable at all, whether it's necessary. But I think, on my path, faith has come down to being willing to question things that seem so important in our society. And I think, learning and the intellectualization of our life is one of them. To kind of dare yourself to put thought under the spotlight for questioning. And, normally when I've done that with various other aspects of the activities of the self that I see within me, I've never really regretted being able to become aware of these processes, and through that awareness alone, understand how things come to be. And in this instance, that intellect comes to be as a result of prior problematic activities in your mind that lead to that desire to learn and understand and be able to explain. I've never really regretted becoming aware of these processes and letting them slowly fade away if they will. So this, to me, is this attempt to understand, to me, is the real sleeper in all of this. It kind of creeps up out of nowhere. It hides behind all the other processes. And I think to become aware of that is a really important part of this journey. Thanks for watching.